Thanks for coming back for Chapter 3 of The Great Oildorado. I have to give you a quick disclaimer. This chapter talks about the soiled doves and the free and easies. It may not be of interest to some, so feel free to come back when I read Chapter 4. And now we'll get started on the gaudy and turbulent years of the first oil rush, Chapter 3, the Boomer Brigade. The 49ers who panned through the gold rush and now swaggered to Oil Creek, expecting a rather panty-waist operation, complained that the conditions here were crazier than anything they'd ever seen. One miner said that if a new well brought up huge gold nuggets, the owner would throw them back in and go on drilling for oil. This may have been a slight exaggeration, but it was true that the great open desert spaces, the frontier stretches and mountains, couldn't have produced this fiercely concentrated frenzy, squeezed as it was those first years into a greasy mud furrow not more than 20 miles long on Oil Creek. Rich men, poor men, speculators, thieves, they were all packed together like oily sardines in a barrel. The two little villages, Titusville and Cornplanter, one on each end of this furrow, was overcrowded, and it was the most coveted land on earth. Between the two towns, derricks were going up so fast you couldn't see the trees for the wood. Wild turkeys took to the far hills, clucking in fright. The once serene valley, with its very few remote farms and thick timber, were parceled off in patches, almost like a crazy quilt, with the wooden structures stuck on like clothespins. Axes swung and trees fell, and they were hauled off to slap up into new houses or for the free and easies where gamblers and the soiled doves were already setting up shop. Saloon keepers who had cut their eye teeth or their whiskey in frontier towns, where polished six-shooters and dandified gamblers were stock equipment, didn't so much mind doing business in the shanties. But the mud, it drove them crazy. Customers wore thigh-high boots that oozed at every step, and even when a man sat down, he left an oily imprint. The more genteel proprietors tried valiantly to keep up appearances. Some of them wrapped the legs of the old piano in newspapers and rags to protect them from the filthy kicking boots. Drillers' apprentices, tool dressers, or toolies, wore railroad boots that cost $1.50, and they could thump to a fiddle and a foot a fast hoedown to the music of Chase the Squirrel. Most of the toolies were as lively and agile as monkeys. One of their chores was to climb up to the top of the derrick to grease the crown pulley, and it was the toolies who rigged up the pennants that floated and flapped from the derricks, with the names like Big Baloney, Old Misery, Scared Cat, the Vampire, and Sleeping Beauty. Toolies made $2 to $3 a day for a 12-hour shift and spent it as freely as oil. To accommodate the day and night shifts, saloons kept jumping around the clock, and there were always self-styled ladies handy in what a preacher called suspicious houses. But the soiled doves, the patrons, the rig builders, the toolies, teamsters, drillers, even when they came away with cleaned out pockets, they weren't suspicious. They seemed to feel that they'd gotten their money's worth, and they drowned out the Methodist dissenters with their roar of approval. And it went something like this. The Oil Creek girls are the dandy girls, for their kiss is most intense. They've got a grip like a rotary pump that'll lift you over the fence. Don't say I didn't warn you. It was said that the amorous French arts of one of these girls could make even a teamster blush, and this was considered going some. The raftsmen who had prided themselves on their toughness were outnumbered by the oil-hauling teamsters who were tougher. For years, the raftsmen running logs downstream to Pittsburgh would stop overnight at the Riverside Moran House at Cornplanter. In logging season, the rafts would be tied up and stretched a half-mile above and below Moran's, while the pilots and the raftsmen frolicked inside and sang their favorite tunes. But now their main cargo was oil, and they were just a drop in the bucket compared to teamsters who swelled to 4,000 in number. Day after day, wagons loaded with oil barrels stretched in an endless chain along the quagmire roads, from the wells to the nearest railroad depots over at Garland and Union, about 20 miles from Titusville. Every piece of furniture, and even the coal for the engines and the engines themselves, had to be hauled into Oil Creek by teams and through the mud that was unclassable, impassable, and sometimes jackassable. There's the story about a stranger who was slogging along and kicked what seemed to be a man's hat lying in the middle of the mud. From the depths a voice came angrily and said, "Say, that's my head in that hat. Don't you kick it again." The traveler peered down horrified. "Well, you'll be buried alive," he said. "Never you mind, stranger. I've got a good mule under me," he said. It was the custom for many teamsters to carry a keg of beer along with them when their wagon wheel sank to the hub, and they wet their outsized vocal cords between cursing and the poor struggling horses. Teamsters had an awesome vocabulary, blasphemous, brimstone-tongued, and they were the meanest fighters around. In saloon brawls, a teamster often bit off an opponent's nose, a portion of the upper lip, or a chunk of ear. And I don't say he chewed it like tobacco, but he didn't apologize either. And this disgusted and baffled the transplanted Westerners. Imagine biting a man instead of shooting him neatly, one Californian said. Word of the Teamsters rolling in money brought plenty of hopeful beginners to join their league. One of these came from downstate, and on his first morning of hauling oil, his wagon bogged down at the bottom of a very steep hill on his way to Titusville, and it took him all day to pry it loose. He had just reached the top of the hill at dusk when the end gate broke and all the barrels rolled out and downhill. The infuriated teamster yelled after them, "You can all go to, I'm going back to York." The teamsters who stuck it out got arrogant on power. During their heyday, they had the well owners over the barrel. They gouged exorbitant fees, and once a group of teamsters made desperate producers bid at auction for their services, and the highest bidder got his oil hauled at $5 a barrel for a 6-mile trip. Even drillers, which were a new breed of master artisans, made only $4 to $5 a day. On the job, on the high stool in the derrick called the driller's throne, they were highly responsible and proud of the tricky skill of handling the tools and the cable. The best ones had a tactile intuition that made them know in their fingers what was happening underground and whether they were close to a strike. For celebration, when a good well came in, the producer would buy his driller a fancy new outfit, like a winning jockey's silk, with $12 Wisconsin boots, and the wide brim hats that distinguished them from ordinary men who wore inverted soup bowl derbies. Right off, the driller would take his new pristine hat to the well and initiate it, with a few dabs of the oily slush from the sand pump. If there was anything that marked a man as an amateur and someone who didn't belong in Petrolia, it was said to be an immaculate, too slicked up with water, unoiled hat. A visitor to Corn Planter wrote home despairingly, "How shall I describe this place unless my pen is dipped in mud?" he said. There was one main street, filthy and snarling, with piles of barrels in lurching pyramids wherever you looked, and a welter of garbage, ashes, and herring boxes dumped by the new hotels and the groceries lining the streets. This was the main shipping point of the oil region, where 1,600 teamsters brought their loads every day, and the river was teeming with flatboats and barges, all greasy, all with barrels banging around. The reek of petroleum hung like a mist over the village, and even the hitching posts were oily. The walls of each shanty were slimy to touch inside and out, because the town had no place to spread except up, with a steep hill on one side and a rocky cliff on the other. Dynamiters swarmed, laying charges to gouge out niches for yet another rickety building. A bystander, hearing a shout of blast, barely had time to leap before the boulders came tumbling down. When the frame went up, the 3-inch battens were slapped over the gaps between the wall timbers, and nobody thought of plaster or paint. Everything had a flimsy, impoverished air, because whatever was put up one week would be torn down and outgrown the next. In the Williams Brothers store, a bunch of the boys sat around on molasses kegs one night and decided that the Indian name of corn planter was too old-fashioned for their bustling metropolis now. Who planted corn anymore, they said. And since every square inch of farmland was being leased, and it was a new hustle and bustle city, the boys settled on the name Oil City, and Doc Christie brought over a bottle of medicinal whiskey from his drugstore to christen the new borough to be. Newcomers who had been in the oil region just a week were beyond being surprised at anything they saw. Reporters who tried to convey what it was like in their dispatches back to their papers were doing their very best to record the phenomenon, and they didn't quite believe it themselves. More than one newspaper editor refused the story and sent back strong warnings to sober up and enough with this nonsense. To combat this and to assure their editors that what they were saying is true, they would put in their article that we ask you to believe that we are neither drunk nor crazy, though we shall hardly expect strangers to oil diggings to believe all that we are about to tell you. The first man who wrote any sizable account of the early wells was Thomas Gale. He wrote in the June 1860, The Wonder of the 19th Century Rock Oil in Pennsylvania, that one is almost constrained from his intuitive notion of the natural world to suspect such a story is a whopper, and that the man who talks in this manner of oil flowing up has been drinking poor whiskey. But good vouchers are at hand. The vouching eyewitnesses included city promoter like Bissell, who was rather miffed in the midst of their frenzied large operations, their leasing and lawyers and hirings and engine haulings, to see the village shoemaker quietly get his foot in ahead by kicking down the very next well after Drake's without a smidgen of imported machinery in the fall of 1859. Of course, it upset Bissell, but it didn't surprise the people of Titusville in the least. William Barnstable was as good a shoemaker and tanner as you'd find in 10 counties. He was a member of the town council who said little, and what little he said made pure sense. He was a tall, sensitive-faced, fine-boned man with the hands of a craftsman and the reticence bred in the English countryside. Born in Biggleswade, Bedfordshire, he had come to America with growing pains and founded what was called the Natives the English Settlement outside Titusville in 1832. Soon he moved into town and began making and mending shoes, sticking to his last until Drake's well galvanized the countryside. Barnstall's brother-in-law, James Parker, had a farm a few hundred feet from Drake, just over the line in Crawford County, which the shoemaker began drilling on. He used a crude hickory spring pole with stirrups, and it was operated by foot. It was hard work, but it was a good cheap way to drill when a man couldn't afford an engine. To finance the cost of the tools made by Titusville blacksmith named Locke, Barnstable took in 2 partners, Boone Meade and Henry Rouse. When he got down a few inches below the depth of the Drake well, the watching crowd of villagers and strangers, the first ever engaged in what was later known as sitting on a well, were ready to give up their places at what seemed to be a flop show. The hole was dry, they croaked. It was deeper than Drake's and no sign of oil. There was no sense in going on. But he got the grease at 84 feet, and the new Barnstable well was the lion of the valley, crowds lined up at the creek bank, waiting their turn to pay 10 cents to be ferried across by flatboat to see this stupendous 10-barrel-a-day marvel. The next well, kicked down by Titusville blacksmith David Crossley, made an even bigger splash on white vests. The pudgy-cheeked, iron-muscled Crossley had been pointed out to visiting lumbermen respectfully for years, because he was the one settler around who had walked all the way from New York. As an adventurous 12-year-old in England, he had run off to Liverpool and stowed away on a ship sailing for America. Once there, he located relatives in New Jersey and bound himself out to learn blacksmithing. Looking for a community to set up a smithy in after he married, he walked 450 miles to Titusville and to the English settlement. He liked what he saw, and then he walked all the way back to collect his wife. By this time, having developed his calf muscles in these marathons, he was in excellent shape to kick down the deepest well yet at 124 feet. It was on the creek bank near Drake's, and sightseers nearly swamped the flatboat ferry in their eagerness to get close to the well that they called the Elephant. Skeptics, among them some Wall Street men, stood by with watches in hand and timed the well like a racehorse. They were open-mouthed at the yield, 15 quarts a minute. A representative of the Chautauqua County Journal, reporting this, forestalled any suspicions of his own liquid content by explaining hurriedly that the men who had timed it were well known and they were reliable citizens. The greatest excitement exists in that region, and fortunes are made in a few minutes by the sale or lease of lands. Wells are sinking in every direction, and strangers are flocking in from all parts of the country. Meanwhile, Thomas Gale wrote his exclamation points, saying that it was a splendid thing in the Crossley well, a diamond of the first water, enough of itself to silence the cry of humbug, to create a sensation among rival interests, to inspire hope in many toiling for the subterranean treasure, and to make every son of Pennsylvania rejoice in the good providence that has enriched the state with rivers of oil. And Drake, who was putting down a second well for his employers, wrote Townsend and said, "The town is full of anxious seekers, all determined to make a fortune or bust in the attempt." The serene little village of Titusville now looked as if some shanty town had been wrenched upon it in a hurricane and flung down here helter-skelter among the prim white clapboard houses. Sidewalks were narrow planks in a sea of muddy mire, and newcomers walked the plank in more ways than one. Land sharks lurked in the offices that didn't yet have a roof and seldom a solid floor for their high-sounding propositions. The mouths of speculators yielded more oil than the best wells on the creek. You could buy 1/16th or even a 16th of a 16th of the greatest moneymaker, a new well that was due to pour out wealth any day. Look at the map and see how it sits in the juiciest strip of creekland, they'd say. On paper it all looked foolproof, but nobody had yet discovered that 1 out of every 3 wells was a duster, or it was dry. And the boomers and the shady speculators who moved in to make a fast killing needed only a handful of blank leases and revenue stamps to be in business. Every newcomer, whether honest buyer or boomer, had maps bulging in the breast pocket of his long-waisted frock coat, purporting to show just which choice leases were still available. Some of the maps were as near accurate as anything could be, done by civil engineers already sent out by the responsible companies, acting on solid fact. Oil is getting popular as an illuminant and lubricant, so we'll invest in oil lands. But facts had almost no connection with the mass buying hysteria, the grab for whatever was offered. Pretty tinted stock certificates marked $10 a share of property didn't say what property. It might have been in Timbuktu, but the filled-in stubs of an old stock book of this ilk show that a sucker who bought, let's say, 150 worth of these pieces of paper often rushed back and bought 200 more the next day. The fear of being gulled wasn't as acute as the fear of being left behind. Opportunity was knocking at every door and window. The town or crossroads that didn't have its own stock company with a highfalutin title was considered too dead to skin. But by the summer of 1860, there were 600 companies incorporated in Pennsylvania alone, and probably four-fifths of these were phony. During the peak of the boom a few years later, a Boston paper ran a straight-faced announcement on the prospectus of a new company. He called it the Munchausen Philosopher's Stone and Gull Creek Grand Consolidated Oil Company, capitalized at $4 million with a working capital of $37.50. Of course, this was all a joke, but the farmers on Oil Creek were almost the only people involved who didn't enjoy it. From the start, they fared remarkably well against the city financiers, the boomers, and the local tycoons like Jonah Watson. Most of their land along Oil Creek was already leased on a royalty basis, and those who weren't satisfied with the original deal had a forthright way of airing their grievances. The second lease Jonah Watson gulped up was on the John Rind farm, and if he rubbed his big hands and chuckled over getting a bargain, granting a royalty of only 1/12, he must have been staggered to read the large public notice John Rind inserted into the Venango Spectator afterward. And it read like this: Important notice about oil land. Whereas on the 1st of September 1859, certain parties, by misrepresentation, procured from the subscriber a lease for his land on Oil Creek in the county of Venango. Thereby he hereby notifies all whom it may concern that as said interest of lease was procured as above stated, he is determined that the said lessees or their under leases shall never take possession of 1 foot of said land or operate for oil or salt under said contract. John Rind, December 21, 1859. Now, John Rind was the grandson of an Irish woolen factor, and he still owned 300 acres that his grandfather had bought from the Holland Land Company in 1800. He also owned a loaded Irish temper. Within 3 weeks after his bold-faced roar of protest, Jonathan Watson gave in. Watson retreated cheerfully, and the lease with John Rind was changed to 1/4 share of all royalties on oil, and salt wasn't mentioned. The farmer Watson had tackled first of all was Ham McClintock, and he did very nicely too. Jonah subleased large chunks of his land, and each lease subleased part of his piece to get money to put down a well. McClintock didn't bother putting down many wells. He let others take the risk and just pay his royalty. He simply put down mattresses all over the floor of his house, 5 to each room, to bed down these benighted souls. For 75 cents, they could sleep in the hayloft without a blanket. There were 60 wells going down there, with engine houses and lean-tos scattered around like peanut shells, so that McClintock always had plenty of paying guests. He was still so conditioned by his sparse farming days that charging $3 a week for board, at that time eggs were 8 cents a dozen, seemed a bit steep. And one guest said that when a farmer's daughter waited on you around McClintockville, you were never sure whether she was a milkmaid or an oil heiress, or both. Once a waif of about 14 years, whose tattered patched pants were held up by one frayed suspender, pulled a visitor across the creek on a raft slightly larger than a breadboard, and the newcomer was so paternally moved by the lad's obvious poverty that he gave him a nickel tip. He was somewhat discomforted to learn that the waif was really a brand new oil heir. To confuse outsiders even more, some of the newly wealthy farmers went right on living in their same dilapidated cabins, with rags and quilts hung at the windows in the place of panes, and a limp calico curtain partitioning off a sleeping cubicle from the sitting room kitchen. They got up, plowed, and planted as if their lives still depended on it. And in the best sense, perhaps they did. One farmer refused to lease another 5 acres at a plump figure of about 1 million until after he got in his buckwheat crop. I ain't going to have it trampled on, he said. Old John Buchanan complained to a newcomer that he had been taken advantage of in leasing to sharpers and left a pauper. His listener's eyes misted in sympathy, and he pictured the poor old fellow trudging over the hill to the county almshouse until Buchanan finished sadly. So here I am, a poor man with barely $100,000. With 100 wells drilled on his farm and his royalty share 1/4 on each, he may soon have been complaining worth barely $500,000. When one of the soundest companies that had a sublease on the Buchanan property asked a neighboring farmer if he'd like some stock, he said, well, no. He guessed he'd already had a plenty, 3 horses and a yoke of steers. I think it was Farmer John Brind who, once he bested Jonah Watson and made him raise the ante, sat on his front porch rocking day after day, observing the antics of the outlanders who kept arriving by rickety coach or rickety mare or on rickety legs. They came by water, too. Steamers like the Allegheny Belle chugged up the river from Pittsburgh were loaded like cattle boats. A tiny steamer named the Petrolia, once accustomed to carrying about a dozen farmers from Franklin up the 6 miles to Oil City, now carried at least 100 passengers each trip. On deck, a dapper gambler would unroll a large piece of checkered red and black oilcloth, each square numbered, and urge listeners in the jolly tones of a neighborhood bingo announcer to invest 50 cents in his great Havana lottery. For only 50 cents, you had 10 throws of the dice, and if the numbers you rolled matched the numbers on his oilcloth, you were $150 richer. It was understood, of course, that you'd multiply this sum 1,000-fold once you reached oildom. The percentage of winners in the Havana lottery was even lower than oil. If you covered the last lap to Titusville by Huckleberry coach, you arrived with a sore, bruised behind, and with your pantaloons mud to the hip, what with leaping out along the way to help pry the coach out of the holes, push it up hills. When you staggered finally into a lobby and asked a hotel clerk for a room, and he said he'd try to squeeze you in, you discovered he meant just that, in the tightest sense of the word. Eyeing the guests sprawled on the floor snoring, he'd push and nudge 2 bodies until he cleared a space narrow than a coffin, or as one victim said, we were hung 2 on a peg. Lucky arrivals paid $1 to spend the night on a billiard table or sitting up in a barber chair. The most favored individual accepts with grateful joy the offer of a 1/20th interest in a bedroom. All the tender-reared, well-to-do businessmen from Boston, Philadelphia, and Manhattan slept on half a straw pallet and scratched like commoners. Meals were even worse, served in 3 or 4 shifts, with mobs of hungry men crowding impatiently, waiting their turn. At first, the more gentleman types nearly starved to death in the wild push by hardier comers for the food. But the outdoor life of the oil region sharpened their appetites and their elbows, and they soon learned to shove and grab. For what they got might be half-baked water biscuits with salt pork or a few beans swamped in molasses. Steak was so leathery that the uninhibited stood up at the table, braced their feet against a chair, and got a purchase on a dull table knife, whacking the meat like a shoveler dealing with frozen cod. Aficionados carried their own well-honed knives that was stuck in their boot tops. After using them to cut up an indigestible hunk of meat, they tucked the blade back into their boots. For all this discomfort and near hunger, Guests were permitted to pay through the nose as high as $4 a day. If anyone dared to complain, the clerk told him coldly, even scornfully, "This is oil country, you know." Anybody who didn't know it must have lacked all five senses. It was a world so foreign that visitors talked constantly of returning to the States. No customs or castes were familiar. It was as if a portion of the earth had turned upside down and produced this bewildering new democracy where no one could be judged by appearances. One critic snapped, "They don't have time to be aristocrats. They don't even have time to change their sheets." Another wrote a few years later, "That individual right in front of you, this greasy specimen, could by one stroke of his pen produce a paper of more value than all of your worldly possessions, and that would be honored quickly by any great banking institution. That little man to the left, nearly over his boots in mud with hands covered with crude from the barrels which he is filling, handles more money than you've ever seen. And beneath that covering of dirt and oil on the hand which you would now scorn to grasp, there glitters a little sparkler that would delight Tiffany or dazzle the eyes of many a Flora McFlimsy of Madison Square. For the individual is the possessor of a piece of land nearby, which monthly returns him an income larger than that received by the President of the United States each year." Experts, and those were the people that just been there a week, sat roasting their boot heels against the box stove in smoky, crowded taverns, while they gave their geological opinions on what caused petroleum and where it could be found. Some explained, between spurts of tobacco juice onto the muddy floor, that you had to go by the dip in the lay of the land. They said all oil ran downhill underground and was therefore found only by the crick. Even more interesting, oil was a perennial like a daisy and would rebloom every year till kingdom come. Another sect of believers said that oil was produced by the stream from buried volcanoes from the Carbon Age. An old whaling captain from New Bedford, now living in the oil region, had perhaps the most ingenious theory of all. He always expounded it at Carpo's, because another ex-whaler tended bar there, and the captain emphasized the points of his talk by pounding on the bar with his blackthorn stick with the whalebone handle, and every newcomer who would stand still long enough to listen got an earful of the theory. He said a large shale of whales had been stranded in western Pennsylvania at the time of Noah's flood and left high and dry there, and the oil borers were now drilling into that blubber. Even the staunchest whalers seldom accepted this story. The editor of the new Titusville Weekly, the Gazette, was a young newspaperman. His name was Jim Birchfield, and he had moved over from Meadville with a second-hand printing press and set it up on the second floor over one of the new stores at Peter Miller's on South Franklin Street. At 9 o'clock one pleasant summer evening he was working in his office there, correcting proofs, when what sounded like a lynch mob pounded up the stairs and burst in. They had come to tell him that the Williams well, one of a dozen or so on Jonah Watson's piece of land, had been drilled down to a new vein and had struck a 145-foot sensation. Everybody babbled at once, trying to tell Birchfield with gestures and what the new well was like. They were proud of having a newspaper at last, and they were very determined to help the editor do a proper job, even if they had to bang him over the head with a big story. Like any good newspaperman, he grabbed his hat and took off with several of the informers. The Williams Watson well was next to Shoemaker Barnstall's well, named the Lion of the Valley, and on the way there Birchfield passed returning throngs who shouted after him on what they had just seen. Arriving at the well, the editor became rather gibberish himself. The coolest nerve could not witness the scene without excitement. He mentioned the streams of oil overflowing the vat and running along the ground, and then went on painting this picture. We have no language at our command by which to convey to the minds of our readers any adequate idea of the agitated state at the time we saw it. The gas from below was forcing up immense quantities of oil in a fearful manner, and attended with noise that was terrifying. When the gas subsided for a few seconds, the oil rushed back down the pipe with a hollow, gurgling sound, so much resembling the struggle and suffocating breathing of a dying man, as to make one feel as though the earth was a huge giant seized with the pains of death, and in its spasmodic efforts to retain a hold on life was throwing all nature into convulsion. During the upheavings of the gas, it seemed as if the very bowels of the earth were being all torn out at her sides. At times, the earthly sounds drew one almost to sympathize with the earth as though it was animate. A year or so later, newsmen were doing their pop-eyed best to describe the first real gushers, 3,000 barrels a day, higher than steeples, and they would be accused of drunkenness or even insanity a good many times, as one improbable event followed another. But that first year, the baby industry was still so freakishly new that each little well was touted like a three-headed cow. In fact, the first well drilled away from Oil Creek got more headlines all over the country than a good many gushers later, because there was a pretty girl involved. A blacksmith in my hometown of Franklin found oil right in his own backyard, and that is when our town went crazy.